I apologize in advance. It's never as exciting as the student presentations. Can you hear me in the back okay? So tonight we're talking about one of the goals that was set for me at the beginning of the year, back last summer, which was to come back to the board with a proposal for how we could expand a tuition program. So for everyone's knowledge, we already allow tuition-paying students. So board policy already allows us to accept students from outside of Warren Township. That happens most often when special education students come into the district, but we do have the allowance for any student to come to the district at tuition. It's pretty rare. The truth is, when we get inquiries, and we get a couple every year, they often are run off by the cost of what it would take to pay full tuition to come to the district. But we right now have one tuition-paying student, a family that moved out of the community and chose to stay in the schools paying tuition in this way. The goal was to develop a proposal, as I said, about expanding that program. This is one of the topics that came up last year as we looked at how can we counter declining enrollment in a way that maybe allows us to preserve some positions or expand on the offerings that we have, bring in some revenue to offset those things. So as we do with all these presentations, I'll go through the work that was done, what we learned, and what the recommendation is to move forward. So as far as the summary of work, we always look at comparable school districts, but for this question, there are not that many comparable school districts that have a full-scale tuition program. So we had to expand that a little bit. We looked at other opportunities, so you might have heard the term school choice. There is a State Department of Education school choice program, which we looked at to see whether that was a viable option. Spoiler alert, it's not really a great option for us, but we did look into it. We also compared the tuition rates of the private schools that students who came to Warren Township Schools K-5, but then went to private school in grades 6 through 8, what the tuition and expenses are at those schools. Because if we do move forward and try to convince residents of surrounding towns to send their children here by paying tuition, we should know what the competition might look like. We surveyed our staff about staff members who might be interested in sending their children. I met with the high school superintendent because one of the major roadblocks that we're finding will be parents might consider paying for tuition if it can continue through high school. They don't really want a program that ends at 8th grade because then they have to go back to some other school district for high school. And we discussed the cost and benefits. So you can do anything, but there are startup costs and then there are ongoing costs that go with that. Is it worth the amount of work it would take on administrative time and staff time for whatever benefits there might be? Findings. As I mentioned, the school choice program isn't a great option. If you participate in the school choice program, there are very specific restrictions on what you can do and how you can do it, on the amount of money you can charge, on whether or not you can choose which student to accept, or if there has to be a lottery system, and a host of other considerations. There are two other districts in the state that I was able to find that have similar programs to what I was envisioning a year ago when the conversation started. One of them is much more similar to us than the other. Haddonfield, which is down in Camden County, is a very similar socioeconomic community. It is a K-12 district, though. They've had a program in place for almost a decade, so they've worked through the kinks. They understand the importance of, say, advertising and recruitment strategies, so they were a really good resource. The other one is a high school-only district, Woodstown Pilegrove, also in South Jersey, that we looked at as well. And we also know that many districts have a tuition program primarily for their staff members. So and this ranges dramatically. So at Watchung Hills Regional High School, staff members are allowed to send their children to school there at 50% of whatever the tuition rate is. At Bernards Township, staff members are allowed to send their children there at 0% tuition. It's a free service that is offered. And then there are places where it's 100%. So there's a huge variety that's usually handled through the collective bargaining process as a negotiated benefit to staff if it's available in the contract. We surveyed our staff here. We were looking for staff members with school-age children. 54 such staff members responded to the survey, and we asked them whether or not they would consider sending their children here. And the results are, without there being a financial incentive, the answer is probably not. Even with the financial incentive, it would have to be a pretty good financial incentive because the per pupil cost is so high for tuition. And this gets a little bit small, but essentially this is the how likely are you for staff members. So if you were told that you'd be paying 100% of the tuition, 100% are unlikely in that case, all the way down to 0% tuition. About half of the people who responded said they were still unlikely, even if it was free. So they're not really looking for that as something. And then versus the likely side, and my focus is really on that group in the 33% range of if there was a significant discount of 75% off, we would be likely or very likely to consider the possibility. And I'll talk more about follow-up surveys that we've done since the initial survey as well. You should know that tuition costs are up to each individual district. So we have, as a board, the authority to set tuition at whatever rate we want. Typically, or traditionally I should say, what we've done in Warren Township is match the New Jersey Department of Ed calculation for per pupil cost. So as per pupil cost goes up, tuition goes up. The challenge right now is, as enrollment goes down and fixed costs stay the same, it costs a lot of money to operate buildings. There are positions that will never go away, whether you have 250 students in an elementary school or 500, like there will always be a principal. The per pupil cost keeps going up, even as we try to have responsible budgets. So the per pupil cost for tuition is very high relative to some other places. Looking at private school data, this is publicly available data, so I can't say that it includes every single discount or option that might exist. But these are the places where our community members are sending their kids if they go to private school very often. You can see the range of prices there. Obviously, that's a private school tuition. That's a different service than a public school. But it's important just for some relative information, I feel. And then the public schools, the two districts that have very similar programs, but also what the high school charges for tuition, I thought was important. So our tuition rates are there, and you can see they're very high because of the per pupil costs that I talked about. Haddonfield and Woodstown Pile Grove are in different cost of living areas. That's really important. The cost of living in the communities where their teachers might buy homes is much lower. Teachers' salaries are much lower. Other expenses may be lower. So it's not really apples to apples, but those are the districts that have this kind of program, so that's where the data exists. But even looking to the high school, which is in the same community, obviously, the per pupil cost there being lower than what we would be charging for our middle school. So recommendations. Number one, we should not be participating in the school choice program. It would take away all kinds of autonomy that we have. It's just not, it wouldn't bring us revenue the way we're thinking about it. There's a lot to work out to have a full-fledged tuition paying program. There's all kinds of legal considerations for the application process. There are considerations about when people apply or want consideration and they have students who might qualify for certain kinds of services. We're talking about general education tuition amounts here, not special education. There are legal documents that will have to be drafted, maybe policy language to be updated. So it's my recommendation that we begin with a very small, limited interest pilot for next year. And we use the lessons we learned through that small group to make a decision about what should come next. How should it be enhanced or grown, or is it not worth the amount of resources it costs to make it happen? In order to do that, I think we need to establish lower tuition rates than our regular per pupil cost based on the analysis that we have there. My suggestion of those rates are here, $12,000 and $14,000. Keeping in mind that there are really no additional costs incurred by the district for adding one student to a class. So we would look to taking tuition-based students and adding them to classrooms that are below the existing class guidance. So we stated last year our goal is for classes to be between 15 and 18. About 30% of our classes are below 15. Adding one student or two students to a classroom that right now is running with 12 or 13 or 14 students would not increase our costs at all, or at least not in any really material way for supplies, would not add a significant burden to a classroom teacher or to any of the other special areas in the school. And so this would be pretty much pure revenue in that case. I'm also recommending that we provide our staff a pretty significant discount to encourage the first couple of people to get started. So my suggestion is $4,000. That number was arrived at because that covers and the calculations from the Department of Education, all of the soft costs about administrative overhead and that sort of thing. So there'd be no loss as long as we brought in $4,000. That would help us seed the program. Based on the surveys of staff members, I predict that that would lead to somewhere around 3, 4, 5, 6 students. That's all we're talking about. A very small number that would allow us to, again, work out the application process, the interview and review process, and everything else. There is no agreement in place with the high school. There would have to be a formal agreement made between the K-8 and the 9-12 if we were going to have a matriculation process, which I think is really important for people who live outside the community who might want to send their kids. There are staff members who said, I will pay to send my student starting in September only if they can continue through the high school. So that is an important piece that we would need to continue working on. I think it's important for the board especially to be aware that the implication is any student we accept as a tuition-paying student becomes a Warren Township student. They count in our test scores, they count in anything that we define. Vandalism and violence, HIV, whatever, they are our student once they start paying tuition to be here. There's obviously necessary startup costs. We talked in the finance committee, we tried to predict what some of those were. It's a little bit hard to know how many hours it'll take for attorney review of the contracts the first time through, but obviously those expenses are much higher in year one than they would be in the future. And if the board approved the pilot, we would have to work very quickly. So it's the first week, the first meeting of April. In our process, we tend to have a presentation, discussion at the following meeting, and then board approval at a third meeting, which brings us all the way to May 7th, I think is the board meeting. So that's another reason why I think we start with staff, where it's a little bit easier to do that turnaround with staff members, and then we learn what are the lessons for year two beyond that. And then to evaluate. The simple answer is if we generate tuition-paying students and we're generating an alternate revenue stream, then that would be successful. But there's also the measure of what's the effect on school climate and culture, if there is one. We would retain the ability to cut ties with a student or a family in a way that we cannot do with Warren Township residents. So if there's a problematic situation, the contract would end. It's a little bit easier for us to handle that, but there will be other impacts, I'm sure. It could be something that's tied to future goals if there is a belief on the board that this should be grown. And really importantly, although this will be a challenge most in the first year, if there's only 1 or 2 students, it has to be self-sustaining. Obviously, the goal is to generate revenue and to maintain what we have, not to put a drain on local taxpayers. That's the overview. I'll move back over there and